This billionaire was speeding down a shortcut in his SUV, racing to sign a massive $2.3 billion contract. But suddenly, a brutal blizzard slammed into the area, leaving his car broken down and buried in the snow. No cell service, not a soul in sight. He was hit by a wave of helplessness, realizing that for once his wealth and power were completely useless. Then, through the thick snow, two young boys in ragged clothes appeared on bicycles. In just 17 minutes, they managed to get his car running again. He offered them $500 as a reward, but they turned it down flat, and the reason would change all of their lives forever. Let us know where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to see tomorrow's surprise. 6:30 in the morning. Richard Lawson tapped his fingers on the hand-stitched leather steering wheel. The sound was dry and rhythmic, like the countdown of a ticking time bomb. Outside, the world was a bleak, gloomy gray. But inside the SUV, the temperature was kept at a perfect 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Richard caught his reflection in the rear-view mirror, not a single hair out of place. His cashmere collar was perfectly smooth, a king sitting on a mobile throne. He raised his left wrist, and his blue-faced Patek Philippe flashed with a cold light. 9:30, a $2.3 billion contract. Those vultures will tear the company's corpse apart if I'm even a minute late. His eyes locked onto the GPS screen. The main route was glowing blood red, a traffic jam. Estimated time 2 hours and 15 minutes. The mountain shortcut showed a bright green, only 1 hour and 40 minutes. The warning from that young assistant yesterday echoed in his mind something about a blizzard. Blizzard my foot. Richard muttered, his voice thick with contempt. He slammed the gear shifter into sport mode. I've been ahead of Wall Street for 30 years. Am I really going to lose to a few snowflakes? He floored it. The car surged forward, leaving the safety of the main road behind. 7 in the morning. Richard leaned back in his soft leather seat, his fingers tapping lightly to the jazz playing on the radio. The car glided silently over the black asphalt. The engine hummed like a purring cat. The roads are clear today, he murmured, a smug smile tugging at the corner of his lips. At this speed, he would arrive 15 minutes early. He glanced at the sky through the windshield. On the far horizon, lid-colored clouds were gathering heavy and dark, but they still felt far away. A single snowflake fell. Tap. It melted instantly against the warm glass. Then a second. A third. Richard clicked his tongue and turned the wipers to the lowest setting. Just a bit of early morning sleet, he reassured himself, trusting the forecast that said the storm wouldn't hit until evening. He even turned up the radio to drown out the faint whistle of the wind. But that confidence lasted exactly 10 minutes. The scattered flakes suddenly thickened, turning into white clumps as big as fists. The wind began to shriek, no longer a whistle, but a howl like a wounded animal. And that's when the first crack appeared in Richard Lawson's armor. Something cold slithered into his chest. Not the temperature, but a feeling. A creeping unease he hadn't felt in decades. His jaw tightened. His stomach knotted. The smug certainty that had carried him through 30 years of hostile takeovers and corporate warfare began to waver, then crumble like a sandcastle against the tide. This isn't right. This isn't what they said. The thought echoed in his skull, growing louder with each passing second. His pulse quickened. A thin film of sweat formed on his palms, despite the cold seeping through the windows. Fear, raw and primal, the kind that money couldn't buy its way out of. His hands reacted before his mind caught up. He killed the radio. The jazz suddenly felt obscene mocking. The silence that followed was worse. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and fast. He switched the wipers to medium. His eyes darted to the speedometer, to the GPS, back to the white chaos outside. Not enough. The wipers weren't enough. He cranked them to the highest setting, his movements sharp and jerky. The smooth ride jolted as a gust of wind slammed into the side of the car. Richard flinched, actually flinched like a child startled by thunder. 7:15. It wasn't just snowing anymore. The sky was falling. The windshield was under attack by millions of ice bullets, relentless and brutal. The wipers thrashed back and forth like a drowning man, making a sharp, helpless screeching sound against the thick white wall. Inside Richard's chest, fear had metastasized into something darker panic. His heart hammered against his ribs. Each beat felt too loud, too fast, like a warning siren that wouldn't shut off. His throat tightened. The heated leather seats, the hand-stitched steering wheel, the walnut trim, none of it mattered. He was trapped, a rat in a gilded cage. I can't see anything. The thought screamed through his mind on repeat. His composure, that legendary ice-cold demeanor that had made grown men tremble in boardrooms, shattered like glass. And then his body followed. The relaxed posture was gone. Richard lurched forward, his chest nearly touching the wheel. His grip so tight his knuckles went white. He squinted until his eyes burned, desperately searching for something, anything. A lane line, a tail light, a shadow in the white void. But there was nothing. Only an endless, terrifying wall of white that swallowed everything. Damn it! His breath quickened, fogging a small patch of glass. He wiped it frantically with his sleeve, a gesture so desperate, so undignified, that the old Richard would have been disgusted. But the old Richard was gone. In his place sat a man stripped bare, feeling a primal terror creeping up his spine like ice water. He realized with horrifying clarity that he was a speck of nothing in the middle of nowhere. And this storm didn't care about his net worth. It didn't care about his Patek Philippe or his $2.3 billion deal. This storm had no intention of letting him go. Beep. The GPS screen flickered with the words, recalculating, and then went pitch black. What the hell? Richard grabbed his latest smartphone from the passenger seat. The screen showed a silent message, no service. He pressed the redial icon. Once, twice, 3 times. Still nothing. Work, I pay the carrier thousands a month, and for what? To look at this dead screen. Richard roared. He threw his arm back. Crack! The expensive phone flew into the passenger seat, bounced, and hit the floor. He punched the steering wheel. His breath came in gasps, turning into misty clouds in the cabin as it started to get cold. His chest tightened. The feeling of control was slipping through his fingers like sand. 7:30 in the morning. Boom! An explosion loud enough to tear an eardrum. The 2.5-ton SUV jolted as if a giant hand had slapped it from the right. My God! Richard screamed, fighting the violently shaking wheel. The car skidded. The rear end swung out, fishtailing across the ice. The tires ground into the road with a horrifying screech. Richard slammed on the brakes. The car jerked to a stop, nose down on the shoulder, leaning at a 30-degree angle. Silence. The sudden quiet was so loud Richard could hear the blood thumping in his temples. He sat motionless for 10 seconds. His hands were still clamped onto the wheel, white-knuckled and trembling. He shoved the door open. The blizzard rushed in, slapping him with the freezing reality. Richard stumbling out his handmade Italian leather shoes, sinking deep into the cold snow. The front right tire was shredded. The metal rim had plowed into the ground, twisted and ruined. Richard stood there in the middle of a white void. He looked around. No people, no lights, only the wind howling like nature's mocking laughter. Fine, fine, he hissed through gritted teeth, swallowing the rage stuck in his throat. You want to play, I'll do it myself. Richard yanked open the trunk. Spare tire, jack, lug wrench. He pulled them all out and dropped them into the snow. It had been 25 years since he had touched grease. He knelt. The cold snow soaked through his thin dress pants, biting into his bones. Richard fit the wrench onto a lug nut. Come on, move. He gritted his teeth, the veins in his neck bulging. He put all the strength of a large man into his right arm. The nut didn't budge. It was like stone. Damn it. He tried again. This time he put his whole body weight into it. Slip. The wrench gave way. Richard lost his balance and fell back, his spine hitting the concrete hard ground. He cried out in pain and scrambled up. His face was flushed red with anger and shame. He kicked the flat tire. He swung his arm and threw the wrench into the white abyss. It vanished without a sound. Richard stood there huffing. The heat of his anger was instantly snuffed out by the cold. He sagged. His shoulders slumped. The billionaire's hands hung limp, covered in thick black grease. In that moment of helplessness, an old memory rushed back, squeezing his heart. This feeling, it was exactly like 5 years ago. We're so sorry, Mr. Lawson. The radar lost the signal. No survivors. The modern phone slipped from Richard's stiff fingers, falling onto the thick velvet floor mat. Silent. That silence was scarier than an explosion. He felt an invisible hand reach into his chest and crush his lungs. He stumbled, his hands clawing at the edge of his polished mahogany desk. His fingernails scraped against the wood, a sharp screeching sound leaving ragged scratches on the expensive finish. Then his knees gave out. Richard Lawson, the man who terrified all of Wall Street, slowly sank to the floor, collapsing like a tower with no foundation. He lay curled up on the luxury floor, gasping for air, shaking as if he had a fever. In his mind, the image of the plane plunging into the abyss was clear as day. Elizabeth, Daniel, Michael, they were down there, cold, alone, terrified, and he was here in a $3,000 suit, disgustingly warm and safe. $2 billion. Ultimate power. He held it all in his hands. But in that moment, it couldn't buy a single life vest. It couldn't buy 1 degree of warmth for his wife and children. Useless. The Richard of the present hissed through his teeth, punching his left chest where his heart was cramping in pain. Hot tears welled up, but the blizzard turned them into cold knives against his skin. He wiped his face with a greasy hand. The black oil mixed with his tears, smearing across his arrogant cheek, turning the face of a billionaire into the face of a tragic clown, performing his final act. Richard crawled back into the car. He didn't close the door. He needed the cold to remind him he was alive. His shaking hand reached into his inner pocket for a crumpled pack of Marlboro Reds. He pulled one out and put it to his lips. It took 3 tries before the flame caught in the wind. He took a long drag. The bitter smoke filled his lungs, calming the tremors in his body. Richard leaned his head back, staring blankly at the suede ceiling. It had been a long time since he smoked, and every time he did it was because despair was eating him alive. If Daniel were alive, he would be learning to drive by now. I'd be yelling at him for hitting the gas too hard. If Michael were alive, he'd be begging me for the newest game console. Richard gave a hollow laugh, a twisted, bitter smile. You won, Richard. You're the richest man in this graveyard. He flicked the cigarette away. The red spark hit the snow, hissed, and went out. The clock showed 7:52. The billion-dollar meeting was gone. His career was on shaky ground. But strangely, he wasn't angry anymore. He just felt empty, a deep black hole in his chest. Ding. No. Not a bell. Laughter. Richard frowned. A hallucination. Was he freezing to death and hearing the Grim Reaper? But the sound rang out again. Clear. Crisp. Cutting through the howling wind. He turned his head slowly, peering through the car window. 2 dark shapes moved through the blinding white wall. 2 old bicycles. 2 children. They were pedaling against the gale, heading straight for him. What on earth? In the middle of this frozen hell, they were laughing. The 2 old bikes screeched to a halt, digging deep ruts into the snow right in front of the glossy black SUV. Richard Lawson squinted through the windshield as the blizzard battered the glass. Out of the white abyss, 2 small figures emerged. The older one was tall and thin, his red jacket torn at the shoulder and flapping in the wind. The younger one was swallowed by a baggy yellow coat, wearing glasses held together by layers of tape. Richard's heart clenched with a sharp, agonizing pain. For a mad second time stopped. His breath hitched. He didn't see 2 strangers covered in snow. He saw the past. My God, it can't be. They were standing there right in front of his car, waiting for him to come home, like they always did. Richard leaned forward, his trembling hand hitting the cold glass. His mouth moved instinctively, whispering 2 names he had only dared to call out in his dreams for 5 years. Daniel. Michael. Was God punishing him, or had the storm brought ghosts back from the past? His voice was shattered, trembling with a desperate hope. But then the wind roared, blowing the snow off the glass. Their faces came into focus, black skin, curly hair, ragged clothes. Not them. Richard recoiled his back, hitting the leather seat. The disappointment hit him heavy and more brutal than death itself. He closed his eyes tight, taking a long, painful breath to drive away the ghosts. Wow. The younger boy breathed, breaking Richard's thoughts. He pressed his round face against the window, his eyes wide behind thick lenses. Check it out. It looks like a spaceship, doesn't it, Marcus? Richard lowered the window, just a crack. The freezing wind rushed in snowflakes, biting at his face like knives. The older boy, Marcus, didn't stare in awe. He kicked down the stand of his rusted bike and walked closer. His calm brown eyes flickered over Richard for a second before locking on to the flattened tire. Do you need help, sir? Marcus asked. His voice was deep and steady, not sounding like an 11-year-old at all. Richard looked at them. Their bare hands were bright red and cracked from the cold. Their thin fingers were shaking uncontrollably. Help! He, a grown man of great stature, was helpless. What could these 2 starving children do? Pity mixed with irritation rose within him. He didn't want anyone to witness this pathetic failure, especially not children. Thank you, Richard said, his voice cold, trying to project authority to hide his shame. But I don't think you can help. This is grown-up work. This car is very heavy. It's not a toy. Marcus didn't answer right away. He knelt on one knee in the freezing snow. He pulled off his tattered wool gloves, using his bare hands to feel the warped rim and the surface of the rubber tire. He looked up, his hand still on the damaged wheel. "A tire is a tire, sir," Marcus said, his voice strangely calm. He wasn't intimidated by Richard's sharp gaze or expensive suit. "5 lug nuts, a jack, a spare. It's all the same. Steel doesn't know the difference between an expensive car and a cheap one. It just follows the laws of physics." Richard was speechless. Was this boy lecturing him? He was about to retort when the younger one, Elijah, pointed at the half-burnt cigarette on the ground. "I saw you sitting in there smoking for 10 minutes. Elijah said with innocent honesty. "If you knew how to change it, you'd be done by now, right?" Richard felt his face burn. Stripped bare by the truth from a child, he was a terrible liar and an even worse mechanic. "Listen," Richard snapped lightly, trying to salvage some pride. "I appreciate the gesture, but this is a complex air suspension system. You can't possibly—" "Do you have an important meeting?" Elijah interrupted, tilting his head. Richard started. "How do you know?" "Because you check your watch every 20 seconds. The boy grinned. "My mom says men only look at their watches that much when they're late or afraid of their wives." Richard glanced at his wrist by reflex. 8:03, 1 hour and 27 minutes left. Time was bleeding away, and he was arguing with kids. He let out a long puff of white mist. His pride surrendered to the pressure of the clock. "Fine," he said, sounding reluctant. "Give it a try, but be careful. Don't scratch the paint. And if it doesn't work, don't blame me." That was all they needed. The brothers dove into the work. No huddle, no assigned roles. Marcus went straight to the trunk and hauled out the heavy spare tire. He was thin, but he lifted it with technique, using his thighs to take the weight instead of his back. "I'm Marcus," he said briefly. "My brother is Elijah." "Hi, sir. I'm Elijah the apprentice." The little one waved before grabbing the jack and sliding under the car. Richard stepped out, standing awkwardly to the side. He saw Marcus struggling with the first nut. He took a step forward, his hands reaching out clumsily. "Do you need me to hold anything?" He felt ridiculous, a billionaire asking for a job from 2 children. Marcus didn't look up. "No, sir. Stand back. You'll get snow on your shoes." Richard froze, then slowly pulled his hands back, shoving them deep into his pockets. "Huh," Marcus grunted. Instead of pulling with his hands like Richard had, the boy stood up and placed one foot on the wrench handle. He held onto the side of the car for balance, then used his entire body weight to bounce down hard. Creak. The nut turned a full rotation. Richard's eyes widened in shock. How did you do that?" he blurted out, forgetting his pride entirely. "You have to turn it the right way, sir." Elijah looked up to explain, his tone confident, like he was teaching a slow student. "And the most important part is setting the jack at the right anchor point first. I saw the marks in the snow. You had the jack in the wrong spot." "I had it wrong." Richard frowned. "Yes, sir. You put it on the plastic trim. If you lifted it, the body would crack, or the jack would slip. It has to go on the structural frame." Elijah pointed to a solid metal beam under the chassis. "Right here, sir." The tire change unfolded like a performance. Marcus worked with incredible speed and precision. He removed each nut, not tossing them aside, but handing them to Elijah, who lined them up neatly in the hubcap. "You have to loosen them in a star pattern," Marcus murmured, more as a reminder to himself, but loud enough for Richard to hear. "Top, bottom, left, right. Keep the pressure even so the wheel doesn't warp." Elijah pumped the jack. His small arms tensed as he rhythmically lifted the 2.5-ton beast off the ground. The 2 brothers moved in perfect harmony, no wasted motion, no arguments. They moved like a professional pit crew, communicating with nothing but glances. Richard stood there feeling completely useless. He looked at his expensive suit, his soft hands that only knew how to hold a pen, and then at these 2 poor children. They had nothing but rags and red cracked hands, but they had what he lacked: survival skills and resilience. "Where did you learn to change tires?" Richard asked, the condescension gone from his voice, replaced by genuine curiosity. "Our dad taught us," Marcus replied, his hands busy fitting the spare onto the axle. He didn't look up, completely focused. "Before he died 2 years ago." Richard held his breath. 2 years ago. He did a painful calculation in his head. Marcus was 11. Subtract 2 years. At 9 years old, this boy had stood at his father's grave. 9 years old, the exact same age Daniel was when that plane went down. The coincidence was chilling. Here was a father who lost his sons looking at sons who lost their father. Richard stared at Marcus's thin back. The boy didn't seem sad when he mentioned death. He simply kept turning the nuts. That heartbreaking composure made Richard's nose sting. He wanted to offer some comfort, something like, "I'm so sorry." But the words felt hollow. In the face of this raw loss, all words were empty. He could only stand there, clenching his fists in his pockets, feeling his own loneliness find a rhythm in these two strangers. "Was your father a mechanic?" he asked softly. "Yes, sir. The best in town." Marcus's voice rang with pride, his eyes sparkling at the mention of his dad. He could fix anything, from a tractor to a wristwatch. He said a man has to know how to fix his own trouble. Richard swallowed hard. A poor mechanic had taught his sons how to survive and keep their dignity. And he, a billionaire, what had he taught his sons before they were gone? He never even had the chance to teach them. He watched the two children working in silence through the blizzard. A wave of gratitude washed over him, mixed with a deep ache. "Where are you going in this storm?" he asked. "Schools are closed, aren't they?" "To shovel snow for Mrs. Miller at the end of the road," Elijah replied, his smile still bright, even though his nose was red from the cold. "She's old. Her back is weak. If the snow blocks her door, she won't be able to get out for food." In this blizzard, Richard was stunned. "The storm will get worse later," Marcus said, tightening the last nut with a powerful stomp of his foot. "Better to do it now than let her get trapped." Richard was speechless. These two children who had so little themselves were willing to charge into a blizzard to help an old neighbor and had stopped to help a rich, unpleasant stranger like him. "Done, sir," Marcus announced, standing tall and wiping his greasy hands on his pants. Elijah quickly lowered the jack. The SUV landed softly on its 4 sturdy wheels. Richard stepped forward, looking at the perfectly mounted tire, solid, not a millimeter off. He looked back at the boys. Their faces were flushed from the cold, their breath coming in white clouds, their cracked hands shaking, but their smiles were as bright as the sun. "You actually did it," Richard whispered, his voice full of genuine surprise and admiration. "Told you so," Marcus smiled modestly. "It's just physics, sir." "How long did it take?" Richard asked the younger one. Elijah lifted a thin wrist, checking a cheap plastic superhero watch. 17 minutes. A new record for us. 17 minutes. Richard Lawson, real estate mogul, tech titan, a man whose word shook the market, had fumbled for an hour and failed. And these two boys, 11 and 8, had solved the problem in 17 minutes. He looked into their clear eyes, and for the first time that day, Richard felt a warmth seeping into his frozen heart. Richard Lawson reached into the inner pocket of his cashmere coat, his hands numb as he pulled out a sleek alligator skin wallet. His fingers flicked through a thick stack of $100 bills. The crisp, sharp crinkle of fresh money always brought him a sense of absolute security. Money, the only language this world truly understands, Richard thought. He didn't know how to give sentimental thanks, but he knew how to pay his debts. In his world, gratitude was measured by the number of zeros on a check. He pulled out 5 $100 bills, each one flat and pristine. $500, that's probably a whole month's salary for their mother. Take it, you poor kids. "Here." Richard held the cash out to Marcus. The blizzard whipped at the bills, nearly tearing them from his stiff fingers. "You earned this. You saved me from a disaster. Take it. Buy some warm clothes or whatever you want." Marcus looked at the money dancing in front of his eyes. His brown eyes didn't widen in shock, nor did they spark with greed. They were as still as a winter lake. He looked at the bills, then at Richard's eyes, and slowly shook his head. His grease-stained hands remained at his sides, clutching the hem of his ragged coat. "Thank you, sir, but we can't take that," Marcus said. His voice was steady, without a hint of hesitation, as if Richard had offered him a handful of dirty snow instead of a small fortune. Richard blinked. His hand froze in midair. He thought the wind was playing tricks on his ears. "What?" Richard asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "What did you say?" "We don't take money for this," Elijah added from the side, his tone so casual it was as if refusing $500 was the most natural thing in the world. "Our mom would be mad if she knew we took money from a stranger. But this is $500. Richard stepped forward, nearly pressing the cash into Marcus's chest. The rejection irritated him. It defied every rule he lived by. "Don't be foolish. You just changed a tire in a sub-zero blizzard. You worked for this. Look at your hands, they're bleeding. This is a fair trade. Take it." Marcus took a step back. his steadfast gaze fixed on Richard, a look that made the real estate mogul feel strangely uneasy. "We didn't do it for the money," Marcus said calmly. "We did it because you needed help. Your car was broken and you didn't know how to fix it. It's that simple." Richard lowered his hand. The stack of cash suddenly felt as heavy as a block of lead. He was utterly confused. In his boardrooms, every handshake had a price. Every smile had a purpose. No one did anything for free. Why? Why would they turn down money when they were clearly penniless? I don't understand." Richard confessed, his voice dropping as his arrogant facade began to crack. "Why refuse? This money could help your family so much. Look at your clothes. They're falling apart." Marcus looked at his younger brother, then back at Richard. He let out a long sigh, a cloud of white mist rising from his lips. He walked over and sat down on the metal step of the SUV, ignoring the cold snow soaking into his thin jeans. He patted the empty spot beside him, gesturing for Richard to join him. "Can I tell you something, sir, about our dad?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding hauntingly mature. Richard hesitated for a second, then nodded. He pulled his collar up higher and leaned against the frame of the car. He didn't know why he was standing in a storm listening to a stranger's life story instead of getting inside the heater, but there was a magnetic pull in the boy's eyes that held him there. "Our dad's name was James." Marcus began staring out into the white abyss. "He was a mechanic at Mr. Miller's shop. He wasn't rich. He didn't have a college degree or a fancy suit like yours. He was just a regular guy who came home every day with black grease under his fingernails." Richard listened in silence. He shoved his hands into his pockets, clutching the now awkward stack of cash. "But he had something I haven't seen in anyone else." Marcus's voice warmed with pride. "He never knew how to say no when someone needed help. If a car broke down on the road, he'd stop. If they were too poor to pay, he'd just laugh and say, 'Pay me next time,' even though he knew there wouldn't be a next time. If someone needed a heavy lift or a roof fixed, James was always the first one there." Elijah nodded eagerly, chiming in, "That's right. Once Dad fixed the bikes for the whole school football team and didn't take a cent. He said, 'If the bikes run fast, your legs will run faster.'" "Everyone in town loved him," Marcus continued, "not because he was powerful, but because he was kind." The boy paused. His throat moved as he swallowed hard. "Then, 2 years ago, Dad got lung cancer, stage 4. Richard's heart tightened. He got weak so fast, Marcus's voice began to tremble. He couldn't work anymore. The savings vanished. The hospital bills piled up like a mountain. Mom worked 2, then 3 jobs, and it still wasn't enough for the medicine. The bank sent a foreclosure notice. We were about to lose everything, our dad and our home." Richard looked down at the snow. He knew that feeling of helplessness, the feeling of watching someone you love slip through your fingers while you stand there powerless. But then, a miracle happened. Marcus turned, his tearful eyes shining bright. "A miracle," Richard repeated. "People started coming," Elijah said, his voice excited. "Everyone our dad had ever helped." Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They just showed up. Dozens, hundreds of them. Mrs. Miller, the one we're going to shovel snow for. She's very poor, but she organized a fundraiser at the church. Do you know they raised $15,000 in a single morning? Mr. Patterson at the hardware store, the stingiest man in the county, snuck into the hospital and paid 3 months of our rent in advance for my mom." Marcus smiled through his tears. "And there was this stranger. Dad helped her once when her car died in the middle of a winter night with 2 small kids in the back. He didn't just fix it for free. He followed her for 30 miles to make sure they got home safe. When she heard Dad was sick, she drove 3 hours to see him. She brought an envelope with $2,000 and a giant card signed by 50 strangers, people she had told the story of the kind mechanic named James to." Richard felt a sharp sting in his nose. 2 days before Dad died," Marcus whispered, tears now tracing hot paths down his cheeks. "He called me to his bedside. He was just skin and bone then. He took my hand. His hands were rough and calloused, but they were so warm. He said, 'Marcus, do you see kindness never dies? It's like a boomerang. It travels in a circle and always comes back. I gave my whole life away. I kept nothing for myself, and in the end that kindness saved our family when I fell.'" Marcus wiped his eyes with his torn sleeve. "Then he told me, 'Kindness can't be measured in money, Marcus. Never help someone for a paycheck. Help them because you want to, because it's the right thing to do. That's how you become a good man.'" The boy turned and looked directly into Richard's eyes, a look that pierced the billionaire's soul. I promised him. It was my last promise. I'm going to carry his legacy. I will never sell my kindness. The silence that followed was absolute. Only the howl of the wind and the thud of Richard's heart remained. The 5 $100 bills in his hand suddenly felt like burning coals. He felt ashamed. What am I doing? Am I trying to bribe a sacred promise with paper? Am I trying to put a price on a priceless legacy? So you see, Marcus said softly, we can't take the money. It's not about pride. It's just that if we take it, this is just a transaction. You pay, we fix. End of story. But if we don't take it, it's a connection. And connection is the only inheritance our dad left us. Elijah nodded. Dad said money gets spent, but kindness lasts forever. Richard slowly lowered his hand, slipping the cash back into his pocket. The gesture felt like a surrender to the giant spirit of these 2 poor children. He looked at them, ragged clothes, cracked hands, orphans, penniless. But in front of him, they were the wealthiest people on earth. They had a legacy to be proud of, a promise to keep, and an ocean of love from a father who was gone. And him, Richard Lawson, he had $2 billion. But what else did he have? He shivered, not from the cold, but from a chilling question that just hit his mind. If I died tomorrow, who would come? His lawyers definitely to divide the estate. His partners, maybe to see where the company was headed. But would anyone drive 3 hours just to hold his hand? Would anyone donate money to save him? No, not a soul. Your father, Richard said, his voice raspy and broken, was an extraordinary man. He was the most ordinary man, sir, Marcus replied. That's what made him special. Elijah looked up at Richard through his thick glasses and asked a question that left him paralyzed. Sir, you have so much money and such a big car. Why are you traveling all alone? Our dad was poor. He drove an old pickup truck, but there were always people with him. He always had friends. The question was a knife to the heart. Richard opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Why am I alone? Because I pushed everyone away because I thought money could replace people. Marcus quickly pulled his brother's hand. Elijah, don't ask that, it's rude. Richard shook his head, a twisted, forced smile on his face. It's okay, Marcus. Your brother is right. He fell silent for a long time, staring into the white void. I don't know, Elijah. I really don't know why. Maybe I was too busy earning this. He patted his pocket where his wallet sat. That I forgot to earn friends. Marcus looked at the wealthy man breaking down in front of him. His eyes shone with a deep, quiet pity. Dad said the richest man isn't the one with the most money in the bank. It's the one with the most people who love him. He always said he was the billionaire of this town. Richard nodded, swallowing the bitterness in his throat. Your dad was right. He was the real billionaire. And me, I'm just a poor man holding a lot of cash. Marcus stood up, dusting the snow off his pants. Well, we have to go now, sir. Mrs. Miller is waiting. The snow is getting heavier. The 2 boys bowed politely and turned to pick up their bicycles. Marcus climbed onto his seat and looked back at Richard one last time. Mr. Lawson, Richard started. How do you know my name? Your name is engraved in gold on the door, sir. The boy pointed to the elegant lettering on the car's body. I hope you make it to your meeting on time. The boy smiled, a radiant smile that brightened the gloomy abyss. But if you don't, it's okay. Meetings always pass, but the people we help, the connections we make today, that's what stays forever. That's what our dad said. With those words, the 2 brothers pedaled away into the white veil. The silhouettes of the red jacket and the yellow coat grew smaller and smaller, fading until they vanished behind the heavy falling snow. Richard stood there, rooted to the spot, alone on the silent road. The storm still roared, but inside him, it was unnervingly quiet. His hand was still clutching his thick wallet. Richard Lawson pulled his hand out of his pocket and slowly brought it up before his face. He stared at his palm. It was a beautiful hand, well-groomed. He opened his fingers. A stray snowflake fell right into the center of his palm, melting instantly into a freezing drop of water. Richard Lawson put his hand back in his pocket and turned toward his luxury car. For the first time in 58 years, he realized something. There are those with not a penny to their name who have everything, and there are those with everything in their hands who, in the end, hold nothing at all. Richard pulled the SUV into the underground garage of the Paramount Tower with exactly 38 minutes left on the countdown. The 47-story tower pierced the gray winter sky, a perfect block of glass and cold steel, just like his life. He tossed the keys to the valet without a word. His body was in Denver, but his mind was still stuck on that snowy mountain pass. The elevator doors slid open. Patricia was already waiting in the lobby. The moment she saw him, her face shifted from relief to deep concern. With her brown hair in a tight bun and her rigid business suit, she held her tablet like a shield. She had worked for Richard for 12 years. She knew him better than anyone. And right now, she knew something had shifted inside her boss. "Mr. Lawson, thank God. I couldn't reach you for hours. Mr. Chen has been waiting for 20 minutes. He is losing his patience." Patricia hurried after him toward the private elevator. She glanced at his appearance and hesitated. "Are you all right, sir? You look very different." Richard didn't answer. He pressed the button for the 47th floor and watched the digital numbers climb. "Mr. Lawson," Patricia gently touched his sleeve. "Sir, we need to review the final numbers before—" "What?" Richard blinked, turning to her as if she were an alien who had just landed on Earth. "The numbers, sir, for the presentation. The projected cash flow for the third and fourth quarters." "Right." Richard nodded slowly, his voice hollow. "The numbers." The 47th floor boardroom was a masterpiece of luxury. Glass walls overlooked the Denver skyline and the distant majestic Rockies. Richard Chen was already seated at the head of the table, a man in his late 50s, hair slicked back with high-gloss gel, wearing a smile that reached his ears, but eyes that remained ice-cold. A mirror image of Richard Lawson, differing only by a name. "Richard, cutting it close. That's not like you at all," Chen said, his voice thick with mockery. Richard sat down, not bothering to fire back. He opened his laptop. The charts appeared. He started talking. The technical jargon flowed out of him automatically, like a pre-programmed machine. Market projections, mergers, cost optimization, headcount reductions. Words he had said 1,000 times. Words that used to be his life. But today, in this room smelling of expensive cologne and raw ambition, they sounded fake, cheap. As you can see on page 7, the post-merger entity will generate $470 million in annual revenue. Richard clicked the remote, but his eyes drifted to the window. Somewhere at the foot of those white mountains was a town called Riverside. He wondered, are they shoveling snow for that old woman right now? Patricia's voice cut through his thoughts. She stood at the door, gesturing. "Page 8, Richard started. The entire boardroom was staring at him. Chen raised an eyebrow, his smile shifting to amusement at seeing the old wolf, Lawson, lose focus. "My apologies," Richard muttered. He clicked to the next slide. The presentation ended in a blur. Richard spoke, but his mind drifted back 5 years. He thought of Daniel. He thought of Michael. Marcus was the same age Daniel was when he died. Elijah was the same age as Michael. The cruel coincidence felt like a joke from fate cutting into his heart with every second. "Well done, Richard." Chen stood up, clapping slowly. "Very detailed. I think we're ready to make this official." The lawyers began rustling papers. A mountain of documents was pushed in front of Richard. Someone handed him a pen. A limited edition Mont Blanc $2,000. He had bought it last week just for this moment. The moment that would carve his name into Wall Street history. The moment that would add $2.3 billion to his empire. Richard held the pen. It felt heavy. He signed, Richard Lawson. Next page, Richard Lawson. His handwriting grew jagged. Every signature felt like a needle injecting numbness into his soul. When the final one was done, Chen shook his hand firmly, the handshake of a man who just won a massive bet. "Congratulations, Richard. This deal is going to bring us both a fortune. We have to celebrate. Tonight at the Capitol Club. My treat." Richard looked at Chen's triumphant smile, at the lawyers packing their briefcases, at Patricia giving a proud thumbs up from the door. This was it, the peak of his glory, $2.3 billion. Tomorrow, his name would be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Rivals would be jealous. Employees would be in awe. But what did he feel? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Only a deep, hollow void in his chest, draining away any drop of joy. "I have to go," Richard said suddenly. His voice sounded strange, as if it didn't belong to him. Chen's smile vanished. "Go where we just closed the biggest deal of the quarter. Something important came up. More important than this." Chen pointed at the pile of billion-dollar contracts. Richard paused. 24 hours ago, he would have laughed at anyone who said something was more important than money. But standing there surrounded by wealthy people who wouldn't care if he died tomorrow, only if the company stock went up or down, he saw the naked truth. "Yes," Richard said quietly, his gaze looking through Chen into the distance. "Much more important." He turned and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. He heard Patricia calling after him, heard Chen's confused questions, but he didn't stop. He didn't wait for the elevator. He pushed through the emergency exit and ran down the stairs. 47 floors. He ran like a madman. His legs ached, his lungs screamed for air. Sweat soaked through his expensive suit. He needed this physical pain. He needed to feel alive, not like a robot that only knew how to sign a contract. The parking garage was dark and cold. Richard sat in the SUV engine off. He slumped over the steering wheel, gasping for breath. The passenger seat still held the dampness from the morning snow. On the doorframe, there was still a smudge of black grease from Marcus's hand. On the window, a tiny handprint from Elijah. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Patricia. He ignored it. Buzzing again. Chen. He powered it off. 3 board members. Off. Richard threw the phone onto the passenger seat. He sat in the darkness in absolute silence, and for the first time in 5 years, he asked himself, "What the hell are you doing with your life, Richard?" He tremblingly opened the car's navigation screen. He typed into the search bar, Riverside, population 1,847, 45 miles southeast. Richard floored the gas. The car surged into the night, leaving behind the lights of Denver and his hollow, glamorous life in New York. He didn't know what he was looking for. He only knew he couldn't turn back. On the winding mountain road, the images of Marcus and Elijah merged with the memories of Daniel and Michael. "Daddy, look at me." The voices of his lost sons echoed in his head, shattering the permafrost he had spent 5 years building. Hot, salty tears poured out, washing away his mask of fake strength. He realized the pain had never died. It was just waiting for 2 strangers to wake it up. The sign, Riverside, population 1,847 inches, appeared lonely under his headlights. The poor town with its dilapidated tin roofs appeared a total contradiction to the wealth he had always known. Richard stopped in front of a shabby place called Rosie's, where a neon sign flickered weakly. Looking at his $5,000 suit and polished Italian shoes, he felt like a creature from another planet. Chime. The doorbell rang. Richard walked in carrying the awkwardness of an intruder. The smell of cheap grease hit him instantly. Conversation stopped. Dozens of eyes, hard-working, weary eyes, turned toward the wealthy man, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and sharp suspicion. Richard stood frozen at the door, fists clenched in embarrassment. Then he saw them. In the corner of the diner, at a worn-out table against the wall, Marcus and Elijah. The 2 boys sat in front of plates of burgers and fries, laughing and talking, their faces bright under the dim yellow light. They looked happier than anyone he had met in the boardroom. Marcus looked up. A fry caught halfway to his mouth. His eyes widened. "Sir, did you break another tire?" The diner went silent. Richard took a deep breath and walked toward their table. The clack of his expensive shoes was out of place on the old tile. "Hello, boys," Richard said. His voice was raspy. "Is your car broken again?" Elijah asked, his eyes wide and worried behind his taped glasses. "Do you need another tire changed?" "No, the car is fine. Thanks to you." Richard shook his head gently. The 2 children looked at each other, then at him. Confusion was clear on their young faces. Then, "What are you doing here, sir?" Marcus asked cautiously. "This isn't the way to New York." Richard opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. What was he doing here? He had just signed the biggest contract of his career. He should be at the Capitol Club drinking $1,000 wine and listening to empty praise. Why drive an hour through the night to this shabby diner? I don't know. Richard confessed, his voice breaking. He pulled out a torn plastic chair and sat down. The cracked cushion let out a screeching sound under his weight. I just needed to see you." The waitress, Betty, walked up with an order pad, her eyes scanning Richard's suit with deep doubt. "What can I get you, sir?" "Black coffee and—" Richard pointed at the boys' table. "Bring me whatever they're eating, and 2 more orders to go." Betty raised an eyebrow in surprise, but said nothing, walking silently into the kitchen. Elijah picked up a fry and popped it into his mouth, chewing loudly. "Did you make it to your meeting?" "Yes, I made it." "That's great. Did you sign the contract?" Richard remembered the moment he held the Mont Blanc pen. He remembered the hollow feeling of Chen's handshake. "Yes, I signed it." Marcus narrowed his eyes. The 11-year-old had a terrifyingly sharp intuition. Then why do you look so sad? Shouldn't you be happy? Richard looked at his hands on the greasy table. This morning, he said slowly, I made more money than most people make in their entire lives. $2.3 billion. The two children gaped. That number was too large for them to even imagine. And I drove straight here instead of celebrating. Richard continued, looking Marcus in the eye. Why? Elijah asked innocently. Because I realized that money couldn't buy the feeling I had standing with you in the blizzard this morning. He reached out, gripping the edge of the table to stop the trembling. I realized I was wrong. I was getting poorer every day, even as my bank account grew. I had forgotten how to live. Richard looked up, staring at the two children through a veil of tears. You taught me a lesson that $2.3 billion couldn't buy. You showed me what Daniel and Michael would have been like if they were still alive. You showed me that kindness still exists. I didn't come here to give you money, Richard said, his voice thick but steady. I came here to say thank you, because you saved me. Not the tire, but the human part of me that was left. The meal ended in a quiet, heavy atmosphere filled with connection. Richard didn't touch his second coffee. He just sat and listened to the boys talk about life in this small town, about the tiny struggles and simple joys he had long forgotten. When the bill was paid, Marcus stood up. His gaze became unusually serious. He looked at Richard, the stranger he had helped hours ago. Mr. Lawson, he said firmly, you said you wanted to know how to help the right way, didn't you? Richard nodded, curiosity creeping into his eyes. Yes, Marcus, I do. Then follow me, Marcus said, looking at Elijah. There's a place where you can help, but not for us, for everyone. Leaving the diner, Richard stepped into the biting cold of Riverside. He followed the two children through the dark streets where the streetlights flickered like the breath of a dying man. The destination was a low red brick building, so derelict it was heartbreaking. Peeling walls exposed the brickwork like open, gaping wounds. On the roof, faded blue plastic tarps whipped violently in the wind, groaning with a mournful sound. A piece of waterlogged cardboard replaced a shattered window pane. The sign, Riverside Youth Center, established 1972, hung precariously. Richard shivered, wondering how this pile of ruins could possibly stand through the winter. Marcus pushed the door open. Creak. The sound of rusted hinges rang out sharp and jarring. Inside, Sharon looked up. She was a kind black woman, her face etched with the deep lines of worry. She wore a tattered sweater, and her fingerless wool gloves trembled slightly, a clear sign that the cold inside was no different from the world outdoors. Marcus, Elijah, Sharon smiled, the warmth of her expression lighting up her weary face. What are you boys doing here so late? It's freezing outside. Then she saw the stranger standing behind them. The smile shifted to surprise and caution. And this is Miss Patricia. Marcus stepped aside. This is actually, I don't even know his full name. Richard. He stepped forward, offering his hand. Richard Lawson. It's an honor to meet you. Sharon wiped her hand quickly on her apron before reaching out. Hello, Mr. Lawson. I'm Patricia, the manager here. Her hand was ice cold despite being indoors. Richard felt a slight tremor as they shook. The heater isn't working, he blurted out, his breath forming white mist right there in the room. Sharon gave a sad smile, her eyes shifting away. It broke down last Tuesday. We're waiting for a technician, but... She trailed off. Richard knew what that but meant. No money. Stepping further in the damp, moldy chill hit Richard's lungs sharper and more biting than the air outside. The room was vast but pathetically neglected. Torn sofas exposed their springs like the ribs of a starving beast. But what squeezed his heart were the children. Dozens of them huddled over their homework, under flickering lights, all wearing beanies, scarves, and thick coats, as if they were still out in the blizzard. 3 tiny heaters ran at full power in the corner, completely useless against the bone-deep cold. Sharon led him further, her voice filled with pride, but her eyes with sorrow. The computer lab was a graveyard of technology. 6 yellowed CRT monitors from the early 2000s, half of them marked broken "Do Not Turn On." The library was just a few empty shelves holding tattered encyclopedias from 1982 knowledge that was nearly half a century out of date. I learned to read here, Marcus whispered, stroking an old book. That sentence made the scrap paper seem sacred in Richard's eyes. They walked past a gym where the floorboards were warped from rainwater, then stopped at the kitchen. It was the coldest, quietest place of all. A 6-burner industrial stove sat covered in dust. "We used to serve hot dinners 3 times a week," Sharon said, her voice dropping as she looked at the unused pots. "But we haven't been able to for 6 months. Budget cuts. We barely have enough for electricity, let alone meat and fish." Richard stood motionless. For 12 years, this woman had used her bare hands to protect 80 children in a house where everything was broken except the love. "How much?" Richard asked, suddenly his voice dry. "To fix everything. The roof, the heat, the computers, the kitchen. Everything." Sharon looked at him and laughed bitterly. "Do you want the real number, or the one I tell people so they don't run away in fear?" "The real one," Richard insisted. Sharon reached into her apron and pulled out an old smartphone with a cracked screen. She opened a document and showed it to Richard. It was a staggering, detailed spreadsheet. Every repair listed with the lowest possible estimate. Richard scanned down to the final line. Total $440,000. He stared at the number. "We've been fundraising nonstop for 2 years," Sharon said quietly, her voice trembling. "Bake sales, car washes, asking every shop for sponsorships. We saved up $23,000. Not even enough to fix the roof. Just enough to patch things up and keep the lights on." $23,000 in 2 years, Richard repeated, a bitter taste rising in his throat. "This is a small town, Mr. Lawson. People work hard all their lives and have nothing left over. They give us what they can. $5, $10, any spare change they can save. Their hearts are huge, but their strength is limited. It will never be enough." Richard sank onto a shredded sofa in the corner. Snap! A sharp rusted iron spring pierced through the padding, stabbing into his thigh through his expensive Italian dress pants. A sharp sting. But Richard didn't move. He didn't even flinch. What was physical pain now? It was just a scratch compared to the disgust he felt for himself. $440,000. Richard buried his face in his hands, his fingers gripping his temples as if to keep his head from exploding. He closed his eyes, but the flashy images of his past danced wildly, mocking him in the dark. "God, you are such a piece of work, Richard." He had burned $500,000 on 3 days in Monaco, $300,000 on a watch that was now gathering dust in a drawer. That money was enough to rebuild this entire place and feed 80 children for years. He had thrown away fortunes on lifeless toys, while this woman had to beg for loose change and count crumpled $5 bills for high years just to keep these kids from freezing. The injustice choked him. The disparity made him nauseous. Richard stood up, walked quickly to the window, and looked out at the dark playground. Snow was covering the rusted play equipment. He thought of his 15,000-square-foot penthouse in Manhattan. It was magnificent and luxurious, but cold and empty, with only him walking through it. Richard turned around to face Sharon and the 2 boys. "I'll pay for it," he declared, his voice echoing through the large room. "Pay for what?" Sharon asked, confused. "Everything." Richard gestured around the room. "The leaking roof, the broken heating system, new computers for the lab, new books for the library, the outdoor playground, the kitchen, everything on your list." Patricia's mouth hung open. She stood frozen. What did you say?" "I will cover the entire renovation cost of this center, $440,000, and I will add a fund to ensure these children get a hot meal every day for the next 5 years. Marcus and Elijah jumped from their chairs. "Are you serious, Mr. Lawson?" Marcus shouted, unable to believe his ears. "Dead serious. You have my word." Richard smiled the most genuine smile he had worn in 5 years. But that's so much money," Sharon whispered, tears starting to spill. "We can't. We don't deserve." "It's nothing." Richard stepped forward, taking Patricia's freezing hands. "That money is nothing compared to the value of this place. Nothing compared to what you've done for 12 years. You and these children deserve much more." Sharon covered her mouth, sobbing. Why are you doing this for us? We're just strangers." Richard turned to the Hay boys, their eyes shining with joy. "Because this morning on a snowy mountain road," Richard said, his voice warm and steady, "I learned a lesson about real wealth, and it has nothing to do with a bank balance. It's about this, about helping when someone is in need, about the connection between people, about making someone's life just a little bit better." A happy tear rolled down Patricia's cheek. "These 2 boys," Richard pointed at Marcus and Elijah, "turned down $500 because they wanted to honor the memory of their father, because he taught them that kindness isn't a transaction, it's a heart-to-heart connection." He looked back at Patricia, his gaze resolute. "And I want to be a part of that. I've lived qua lao in loneliness and selfishness. I want to connect. I want to help. I want to be the kind of person who makes this world better, not just someone who makes himself richer. Will you let me do that?" Sharon was speechless. She stepped forward and threw her arms around Richard. She cried, sobbing like a child, the tears of a release after years of carrying a crushing weight. "Thank you," she gasped into the shoulder of his expensive suit. "Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lawson. You are an angel. God sent you." Richard wrapped his arms around this stranger. The warmth of her body, the shaking of her shoulders, it flowed into him. He closed his eyes, savoring the moment. How long had it been since he had held someone, since he had felt a sincere, selfless hug like this? This warmth was worth more than $1,000 billion contracts. Marcus stepped closer, his voice trembling with emotion. "Mr. Lawson, I don't know what to say." Richard let go of Sharon and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, looking directly into the eyes of his young, great teacher. "You don't need to say anything, Marcus. You've said enough. You taught me everything I needed to know about being a human being." Early morning in Riverside, the sky still held that same dull gray shroud. Doris Mitchell, 62 years old, stood behind the stained beige curtains like a living sentry tower. She had stood there for 10 years watching this cruel world through the cracks in the old lace fabric. And then the silence was ripped apart. It wasn't the familiar sputtering pop of a rusty old pickup truck. It was a low, smooth purr, quiet, steady, and intimidating. 4 glossy black SUVs rolled into the narrow potholed street. The first was Richard's, followed by 3 support vehicles he had summoned from his company. Their deep black paint mirrored the crumbling shacks along the road, twisting the image of poverty into distorted streaks across million-dollar frames. They glided past piles of filthy snow and broken wooden fences, looking as out of place and terrifying as alien spacecraft landing in a junkyard. "My God," Doris whispered, her hand clutching the collar of her nightgown. "Are they here to collect a debt or to take someone away?" In her mind, a sudden appearance of wealth in this forgotten corner of the world never brought good news. It only meant trouble, foreclosures, police, or gangs. The convoy came to a halt, stopping with precision in front of the small Thompson house. The engines cut out at the exact same moment. The silence that followed was bone-chilling. Inside the house, Marcus was tying his shoes. He heard the unusual stillness outside. He ran to the window, standing on his tiptoes to peer through the glass, fogged with steam. His heart hammered against his ribs. Mom," his voice cracked. Gloria ran out from the kitchen, still holding a shoe brush. Her face was gaunt, the circles under her eyes bruised purple from sleepless night shifts. She looked out, and her face went paper white. What is that?" Elijah rubbed his eyes as he walked out, his taped glasses sliding down his nose. The boy let out a long yawn, looking at the massive vehicles with innocent, wide-eyed wonder. "Wow, Mom, look at those cars. They look just like the ones the secret agents drive on TV." Her son's innocence felt like a blade to Gloria's heart. To Elijah, they were beautiful cars. To her, they were the embodiment of a power she could never defend against. The door of the first vehicle swung open. Richard Lawson stepped out. His polished Italian leather shoes touched the filthy slush. His crisp custom suit stood in total defiance of the surroundings. He looked around. Fearful, suspicious eyes peeked from behind cracked window frames. He felt like an invader. His wealth in this place suddenly felt clumsy and aggressive. He walked toward the Thompson front door, but the door was already wide open. "Mr. Lawson," Marcus rushed out, completely fearless. In the boy's eyes, there was no billionaire, no power, only the clumsy uncle from yesterday who didn't know how to change a tire. "Hello, Marcus. Hello, Elijah." Richard smiled, a forced expression under the weight of dozens of watching eyes. "Can I speak with your mother?" "Stay right there." A piercing shout rang out. Doris rushed out of her house, an old wool coat thrown hastily over her shoulders. She stepped between Richard and the children, spreading her arms like a mother hen protecting her chicks, even though her body was trembling. "Who are you?" she hissed, her eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. "What do you want with this family?" Richard paused. "I'm sorry, ma'am, and you are." "I'm the person who will call the police if you don't vanish right now," Doris shouted, brandishing her battered phone. "Look at you, fancy suit. Luxury cars. Men like you only come to a place like this for two things, to scam someone or to take something away." Richard looked at Doris, then at the crowd of neighbors slowly gathering with hostile faces. He realized a bitter truth in their eyes: the rich were the enemy. Gloria stepped onto the porch, her voice weak but trying to remain calm. "Doris, it's okay. I think—" "What do you mean it's okay, Gloria?" Doris turned back, her voice fiercely protective. "You're too naive. Look at those 4 cars. They could swallow your whole house. Don't let him trick you." Richard raised both hands, palms open, a gesture of surrender. "Everyone, please just listen to me for a moment." He took a deep breath, looking Doris straight in the eye before turning to the trembling Gloria. "I understand what you're thinking. A wealthy man in a $1 million car shows up in a poor neighborhood. There has to be a motive." Richard gave a sad, self-deprecating smile. "But I didn't come here as a businessman. I came here as a man in debt." He pointed to Marcus and Elijah. "Yesterday, I was trapped in a blizzard, cold, hungry, and desperate. I have $2 billion in my accounts, but in that moment, I was more useless than a child." Richard looked at Marcus, his gaze softening with gratitude. "These 2 boys stopped. They changed my tire in 17 minutes. And when I offered them $500, the amount of money I thought could buy anything, they threw it back in my face." The crowd went dead silent. Doris lowered her phone, her mouth slightly ajar. "They told me we didn't help for the money. We helped because it was the right thing to do." Richard turned to Gloria. "Mrs. Thompson, your husband, James, he left a legacy that my entire fortune cannot match. He taught these boys how to be real men, while I was just a hollow old man." Gloria covered her mouth, tears spilling over. She looked at her 2 children. Marcus stood tall and proud. Elijah gripped his brother's hand, eyes shining behind his glasses. She saw the shadow of her husband in them. He always said that," Gloria sobbed. "He said it was okay to be poor in money, but never poor in character." Doris slowly let her arms drop to her sides. The aggression vanished, replaced by shame. She looked down at her old canvas shoes. I'm sorry," she murmured. I was afraid they would get hurt. Gloria has suffered enough." "I know." Richard stepped forward gently, placing a hand on the widowed woman's shoulder. "You are a good neighbor, Doris. This neighborhood is lucky to have you watching over it." Inside the small living room, the distinct scent of mold from old houses hit Richard's nose. The paint on the walls was peeling in large flakes. The only sofa in the house was tattered, its springs creaking painfully as they sat down. The contrast was even sharper now. Outside were 4 glossy black SUVs worth $500,000. Inside was total deprivation. But strangely, sitting on this broken chair, Richard felt warmer than he ever did in his high-end leather seats. "Mrs. Thompson." Richard began, his hands clasped tight to hide their shaking. "I have a secret I want to tell you." Gloria sat across from him, her calloused hands resting on her knees. She looked at this powerful man, and she saw in his eyes not arrogance, but a deep, haunting pain identical to her own. "5 years ago," Richard said, his voice breaking, "I had a family. My wife Elizabeth and 2 sons. Daniel was 11. Michael was 8. Elijah, who was leaning against the kitchen door, heard his age and curiously edged closer. I was too busy making money. I let them go on vacation alone, and that plane, it never arrived." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Only the whistle of the wind through the cracked window remained. "When I met Marcus and Elijah yesterday," Richard looked up, tears tracing paths down his cheeks, "I saw Daniel and Michael. If they were still alive, they would be exactly the age of your sons now." He turned to look at the 2 boys. His eyes were filled with the love of a father who had lost his children, seeing life reborn in the form of others. "I don't know why God arranged this meeting, but when I saw your sons refuse my money, I realized how wrongly I have lived for the last 5 years. Richard reached out and took Gloria's thin hand. "Mrs. Thompson, you are working 2 jobs fighting kidney disease, and yet you raised them to be angels. You are 1,000 times wealthier than I am." Gloria burst into tears, the emotions she had suppressed for so long finally breaking through. "I'm so tired, Mr. Lawson. I try so hard, but I'm scared. I'm scared that if I die, there will be no one for them." "You won't die," Richard said, firmly squeezing her hand. "I won't let that happen, and you will never have to worry about money again." He turned to Marcus and Elijah. Innocent little Elijah ran over, placing a small hand on Richard's shoulder. "Don't cry," the boy said, his voice clear. "My dad told me it's okay for men to cry, but after you cry, you have to stand back up." Richard laughed through his tears. A simple philosophy from an 8-year-old child had revived a shattered soul. "You're right, Elijah. After you cry, you have to stand back up." He looked at the three of them, poor and ill, yet bonded by love, and he knew that the 4 black cars outside and the billions in the bank had finally found their purpose, not to show off, but to protect the beautiful, fragile things in this world. That very night, Richard called Patricia. "Cancel all my meetings. I am taking 2 to 3 months of leave." There was a long silence on the other end. "Mr. Lawson, are you sure the board of directors will—" "They will manage. I have something more important to do." His next call was to his lawyer. Set up a foundation, the James Thompson Foundation. Initial capital $20 million. Purpose to support community centers and youth programs in small towns. Start with Riverside. Richard checked into a room at the Pine Motel for $25 a night. The heater rattled incessantly through the night. The television only picked up 3 channels. The mattress sagged deeply in the middle, and the walls were stained with watermarks. He lay there, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, and strangely, for the first time in 5 years, he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The construction crew arrived on Monday. They were the best team money could buy, but Richard didn't just stand on the sidelines and give orders. He was there every single day, swinging a hammer to tear down old walls, hauling bricks and mixing mortar. He lived in jeans and work boots. His hands, which used to only sign billion-dollar contracts, became blistered and then calloused. He looked at those calluses and smiled. Marcus and Elijah came by every day after school. The 2 brothers painted the entire recreation room, taking a whole week to finish the job. Richard stood back and watched them work. He watched how carefully Marcus guided his younger brother and how Elijah tried his absolute best to paint the straightest lines possible. Richard sent Gloria to the finest hospital in Atlanta. She received a full diagnosis and was scheduled for regular dialysis treatments. When Gloria tried to refuse, Richard simply shook his head. "You need to be healthy to keep raising those 2 wonderful boys. This isn't charity. This is an investment in their future." After a few weeks of treatment, Gloria seemed to come back to life. Her cheeks grew rosier. Her eyes grew brighter. She began cooking meals and bringing them to the construction site for the workers, saying it was her way of saying thank you. One day, Mrs. Doris appeared at the site with a tray of warm apple pie. "I wanted to apologize," she said to Richard, her eyes cast down. "About that day, I was wrong to judge you." Richard took the tray. "You care about your neighbors. That is a good thing." From then on, Mrs. Doris brought food every day. She found a new purpose beyond standing behind her curtains and doubting the world. 2 months passed. The community center was complete. The new roof sparkled under the sun. The fresh beige paint with green trim looked warm and inviting. The clear windows let the sunlight flood inside. And on the main door, a polished bronze plaque read, "James Thompson Hall." Marcus stood staring at that sign for a very long time. Tears rolled down the cheeks of the 11-year-old boy who had tried so hard to be strong for 2 long years. "My father," he whispered, unable to finish the sentence. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "He deserved to be remembered, and you kept your promise to him." On the grand opening day, the entire town turned out. 80 children, 30 parents, and many more. Miss Sharon cut the ribbon, tears streaming down her face. The children rushed inside, cheering, running everywhere. Laughter echoed through the building, a sound that the place had lacked for far too long. There was a computer lab with 15 new computers, a library with hundreds of new books, a gym with a polished wooden floor and netted hoops, a kitchen equipped to cook for 100 children, a playground that was vibrant, colorful, and absolutely safe. And most importantly, the heaters worked, spreading warmth into every single corner. Marcus stepped onto the stage holding the microphone with slightly trembling hands. "Many people here knew my father, James Thompson. He taught me that the richest man isn't the one with the most money. It's the one who helps the most people." He looked over at Richard. "Mr. Lawson, you helped all of us. You honored my father, and I want you to know, my father would be proud to call you his friend." Richard did not hide his tears. He let them fall without shame, without trying to hold them back. For 5 years, he had locked away every emotion. Now he let them pour out. A small boy about 6 years old tugged on Richard's sleeve. "Sir, did you build all of this?" Richard knelt down to the boy's eye level. "I just helped. A lot of people helped." "Why?" Richard looked into those wide, curious eyes and smiled. Because every child deserves a safe place to learn and play, and you deserve the best. The boy beamed, showing off 2 missing front teeth. "Thank you, sir," then ran off to play with his friends. Richard stood up, watching the boy join the crowd of playing children. Laughter rang out from every direction. His heart was filled with a feeling he had long forgotten. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was just the simple joy of making someone else's life better. That afternoon, after the opening ceremony ended, Richard sat at Rosie's diner in the same booth where he first met Marcus and Elijah. The 2 boys sat opposite him with plates of burgers and fries in front of them, just like that first day. Betty brought coffee to Richard with a familiar smile. Everything looked the same as it had 2 months ago, but everything had changed. "Are you going back to New York, sir?" Elijah asked, his voice sad. The boy put down a fry, looking at Richard with worry. Richard sat in silence for a moment, looking out the window. The main street of Riverside was as quiet as ever, but now he recognized every shop, every face. "I have been thinking about that," he said slowly. "About New York, about the penthouse, about the company, about my old life." Marcus stopped eating, waiting for the answer. "I have everything there. Money, power, success." Richard turned back to look at the 2 boys. "But I have nothing here." Marcus frowned, not quite understanding. "Nothing," Richard continued, "except for people who care about me for who I am, not for what is in my bank account." He took a deep breath and spoke firmly. "I'm not going back to New York." Elijah's eyes lit up. "Really, sir? Really? I'm going to sell most of the company. I'll keep just enough to live on and to keep helping people." Marcus watched him intently. "You're staying here, in Riverside. I'll be close by. I'll be back often to watch you 2 grow up." Richard smiled. "And I'm going to expand the James Thompson Foundation. I want to help small communities just like this one across the entire country." He paused for a heartbeat. $400 million. That is the amount I am putting into the foundation. Marcus and Elijah gaped at him. Elijah nearly dropped the fry he was holding. $400 million, the boy repeated as if his ears were playing tricks on him. "Think about it," Richard said, his voice soft but filled with determination. "Think of how many community centers we can build, how many children we can help, how many families we can change forever." Marcus fell silent for a long time, staring down at his plate. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. "My dad would be so happy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I hope so, because all of this started with him. It started with what he taught you." Richard looked directly into Marcus's eyes. Kindness cannot be measured in money. He was right about that. But money can certainly help that kindness travel much further. The sun began to set over Riverside as the 3 of them left the diner. Richard suggested they walk home, and they passed by the new community center. The building stood tall in the fading light, its fresh paint glowing the windows, reflecting the fiery orange and red of the sky. The children had all gone home, but the echoes of their laughter seemed to still hang in the air. Richard stopped at the playground, watching the swings sway gently in the breeze. Marcus and Elijah stood beside him, their faces still flushed from a long day of excitement. "Mr. Lawson," Elijah said, "aren't you going?" "Not yet. I want to watch the sunset." The 3 of them stood in silence, watching the sun slowly dip behind the snow-capped mountains. Richard thought of Daniel and Michael. He thought of the afternoons they used to spend together watching the sunset in Aspen. He thought of all he had lost and all he had finally found. "Do you miss your sons?" Marcus asked gently, as if reading the billionaire's mind. Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Every day, every hour, every minute." He took a deep, steadying breath. "But now when I remember them, it doesn't just hurt anymore. I feel grateful. Grateful that I had them at all, even if it was only for a short time." He looked down at the 2 boys standing by his side. "And I'm grateful that I met you. Thank you for reminding me that life goes on, that there is still good in this world, that kindness still exists." Marcus looked up, his expression serious but warm. "Do you believe my dad is looking down on us?" Richard smiled. "I do, and I believe he is very proud of you." "I also believe my sons are looking down," he added, his voice trembling slightly, "and I hope they are proud of their dad too." Elijah stepped forward and took Richard's hand. The small, warm hand gripped his tightly. "I believe Daniel and Michael are proud, sir, because their dad helps so many people." Richard looked down at the tiny hand holding his. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel alone. For the first time in 5 years, he felt like he belonged somewhere with someone. "Let's go," he said warmly. "Your mom must be waiting for dinner." The three of them walked toward the small Thompson house, their shadows stretching long across the road in the sunset. Behind them, the new community center stood strong, the James Thompson Hall plaque glowing in the last light of day. The legacy of a kind mechanic would live on forever, not in money or possessions, but in the children he raised, in the lives he touched, in the kindness he planted that was now blooming everywhere. And it lived on in a billionaire who was once lost but had finally found his way home. The story of the broken car in the blizzard and the two poor boys in Riverside has come to an end, but the warmth it leaves behind will stay with us for a long time. Richard Lawson's journey reminds us of a simple truth, that our busy lives often make us forget that true wealth does not lie in the numbers in a bank account, but in the warmth of the hands we hold during our darkest hours. The greatest legacy we leave behind is not our money, but the way we lived and the way we loved. Have you ever felt lost in material luxury, like Richard, only to find true peace in a small gesture of care? Or was there a moment when you chose to give without calculation, like Marcus and Elijah, only to find a quiet joy in your soul? Share your stories with us in the comments below, because your words might be the light that warms someone else's heart today. If today's message touched your heart, please give this video a like and share it as a gift to your loved ones. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey of spreading kindness together. Thank you for always being here, for listening, and for understanding. May you always keep a warm heart in this vast world. Goodbye, and see you next time.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.